Welcome back. You're still watching World Insight. I'm Tian Wei on CGTN. Let's now turn to the latest on China-U.S. trade. The highly anticipated November meeting, the two countries' presidents, was suddenly shelved due to the unrest in Chile, where a one trade deal was expected to be reached. On Thursday, U.S. President Donald Trump tweeted that a new location will be announced soon, and, quote, President Xi and President Trump will do signing, end of quote. China's foreign ministry said trade negotiators from both sides had stayed in touch and had made substantial progress. A phone call between top representatives is expected this Friday. Last Sunday, a group of scholars from U.S. and China banded together to offer their alternative intellectual framework for the two countries to resolve a conflict. At least they tried. The proposal's authors and signatories include Nobel laureates, economists, and a few scholars based in China whom we have invited to the program. Take a look. For more on China-U.S. trade, I'm joined in the Beijing studio by Zhu Jiandong, professor at the PBC School of Finance, and also Professor Yao Yang, who is the director of the China Center for Economic Research with Peking University. Joining us in Shanghai, we have Jeffrey Lehman, inaugural vice chancellor and also professor of law from NYU Shanghai. What a pleasure to have all of you. One of the important things is that we've seen economists and legal experts working very hard in order to come up with some kind of suggestions for politicians about China-U.S. trade. Professor Yao, what advice at this critical moment you, as a well-known economist, would give?
I think that both countries have to think about the real situation in the two countries, why the trade war has started from the very beginning. Right? On the China side, China is a developing country and is going to be a developing country for quite some time in the future. Right? China is still in a catch-up phase of economic development, so China should be allowed to adopt some industrial policy to promote economic growth and also innovation. In the meantime, we all know in the early stage of economic development, the role of the government is indispensable. Right? So United States has to realize you have to give China some room for economic development.
So you mean mutual understanding in this regard is extremely crucial?
Right. But on the U.S. side, I think China should also realize how big a shock China has created all over the world, not just the United States, but the whole world. But probably the United States in particular, because the U.S. is such a large economy and a large population, the benefits of globalization have not been equally distributed among American population. That has been the cause of the rise of Donald Trump and also the trade war.
Professor Lehman, as a legal scholar, what advice would you give? Earlier, Professor Yao talking about mutual understanding. But based on mutual understanding, can the two countries really do something to smooth out this process, Professor Lehman?
You know, for a year and a half now, the two governments have been talking about 7 different categories of issues, and I think 6 of them are actually fairly straightforward. They involve things like intellectual property rights and technology transfer and exchange rates, and the ability of American businesses to operate inside China as easily as Chinese businesses can operate in the United States, the ability of American companies to sell goods to China as easily as Chinese companies can sell goods to the U.S. I think the negotiators on both sides have made a lot of progress on those issues. I don't think they're actually all that difficult. The 7th area of discussion is the hard one, and that's the one that Yao Yang was talking about, the issue of industrial policy. And I think it's important from a legal perspective for the two countries to have a framework where each one can have its own domestic industrial policy as it chooses. Then the two countries can say, to what extent is my industrial policy hurting your country? And if it's hurting, then we can partially decouple. Then we can have limited trade barriers, carefully calibrated trade barriers that will ensure that each country can do its own thing.
Okay.
And then in the rest of activity, they can keep trading. So that's what the lawyers are trying to work out right now. That's what our group was trying to propose.
Well, I know the lawyers are very busy right now, but you know, even the Vice President, Mr. Pence, who has been considered as quite hawkish toward China, have been saying the United States does not want to decouple from China. So why at this moment, among your group, legal experts and economists try to say, well, why don't we decouple? It seems that you are going one step further than the politicians, Professor Zhu.
Well, so there are two extreme views.
No, I don't.
I guess.
I'll come back to you, Professor
Yeah.
Lehman, later, but Professor Zhu right now.
So two extreme views. One is the so-called
Yes.
convergence. One is so-called decoupling. Our group actually is looking for the middle grounds. So which actually I call competitive coexistence. So I think the first keyword is the middle ground. I think the second keyword is so-called structural. We need to understand, one, the U.S. and China relations is structural, which means we have areas mutually beneficial. We have areas it's competing. We have areas it's confrontation. And also, the world is structural. The U.S., it's the world GDP 24%. China is only 16%. Together, only 40%. There's still rest of the world, 60%.
Right.
So the U.S. and China, the relation in the world also is structural. So for that regards, so we provide this kind of a competitive existence, which could be practical.
Interesting, but you know that is based on the assumption, Professor Yao. Some would argue. People have been arguing. Now, it is important for the two countries to be able to work together, but the question really is, what's the nature of this trade conflict recently? Is it mainly about two countries sincerely trying to work a way out of what you call strategic coexistence or strategic competition? That's up to interpretation. But some have pointed out it's for pure political purposes, at least temporarily. So without sincere ground for discussion, how and you know, to what extent can advice like what you have just raised to be able to achieve its goal?
Well, I don't think the trade tensions are purely based on politics. I disagree with that. I think that there's some substantial issues, real issues in it. It's not just about face or something like that, right? China
It's not about face, it's about elections.
No, it's about the real things, I think. You know, think about the last round of globalization. China has been one of the largest beneficiaries, right? Probably China is the largest one.
And what is wrong with that?
No, nothing wrong, but on the U.S. side, right, they feel the shock, right? Look at China's wealth. It has been accumulated in the last 20 years. Of course, this is because of hard work we have done in China. But you have to be mindful of the shocks we send to the rest of the world. Likewise, the United States has to realize China has its own way to go. You cannot force China to converge to the American system. That phase is just finished.
But you know, it's very interesting, Professor Lehman, whether what Professor Yao suggested could be accepted and adopted by the Chinese side is one question, but whether really there is going to be sincere understanding of where China is heading for and how much effort China will be and has been making in order to make things work between China and the United States be really understandable and understood in Washington and appreciated. That's probably one of the biggest things.
Well, I actually think that there is widespread understanding of how hard China has been moving to try to make progress. I think the issue is not so much about intent. I think the issue is about the effects. And I think, as Professor Yao indicated, the effects of the China shock combined with the effects of technological change, have meant that any time you expand trade, there are going to be winners and losers in each country. But it's meant that it's been very hard for a number of people. And so the question is, should we take a pause? It's not a politics matter, it's a fairness question. And I think the goal of our work is to try to ensure that those fairness concerns are heard and they're addressed in a very sincere way without cutting off trade. I do appreciate Vice President Pence's reassurance that there is no interest in decoupling. There are other people in Washington who actually speak much more harshly and much more strongly in favor of decoupling than Vice President Pence did last week. And I think it's very important that, as Professor Zhu said, we push for the middle ground.
Of course, it's about listening to the words, but also watching the actions. Sometimes the words match the action, sometimes it doesn't. So, Professor Zhu, now, how far are we from the academic perspective from there?
Well, let me give you an example. So you mentioned that there is a political, this kind of environment which becomes the intention, right? But let me give you precisely example. The U.S. and China had this 25% of the tariff increase almost for all trade. However, recently there are withdrawals, there are exemptions for firms, for these sectors and products. The U.S. government withdraw these tariffs, right? So there are a lot of withdrawals. Why? Because for these sectors, let me give you an example, agricultural sectors. Both U.S. and China agree trade would enhance both countries' welfare. So, no, even if there are political differences, even if there are confrontations, but this trade in agricultural sectors, the U.S. would like to export the agriculture sector to China, and China would like to export textile to U.S. It's always there. It's always enhancing countries' the benefits. So, whatever happens, as I mentioned, that it's structural. This comparative advantage sectors is always there. However, within talking these comparative advantage sectors, we also remind us, yes, there are confrontations, military confrontations. So it is more complicated than whether enemy or the ally, this kind of a simple argument.
Besides what's going on between China and the United States, there are also many other things going on many multilateral platforms, meaning that China is interacting with the rest of the world as well, not just the United States. So is the United States as well. And you see the trade between China and the United States sliding down as a result of conflict rather than increasing. And yet the other players, trading players of China, are picking up. So you are going to see a world that is still China and the United States bilateral relations, as crucial as it is, being the dominating topic? Or actually there are new trends already happening as we speak? Professor Lehman, I'll go to you for that, and I'll come back to both of you. Go ahead, Professor Lehman.
Well, I think as the two largest economies in the world, of course, initial focus will be on the U.S. and China and that relationship. In part because both countries have so much to gain from cooperation to the maximum extent possible. You make a good point, though. Of course, you have the EU. Of course, you have Japan. You have other substantial economies that are major trading partners for both China and the United States. And that's why all of us really do believe that in the long run, a multilateral approach, a multilateral framework, one that reflects the WTO's commitments to most favored nation treatment, to national treatment for foreign businesses, is the right approach. We've kind of gotten off track for the reasons that Professor Yao mentioned. Nobody anticipated the technological developments, the move to a digital economy. That's right. And so we need to find a way to get back on track in a multilateral world.
Professor Zhu.
That's a very good question. That comes to my theory, which I call it's a mother-in-law theory of U.S. and China relation.
Do you all have these anecdotes for everything?
So let me tell you my story. U.S. is the a wife, and China is the husband. China, in the family, and the husband and wife quarrel each other, argue each other. But who will decide whether this family will become a happy family or falling apart? It's mother-in-law.
I'm not sure whether I would agree with that.
The mother-in-law,
Go ahead with your analogy.
the key is the mother-in-law will not choose a side, and mother-in-law will keep certainly some independence. So then my argument is the key about the U.S. and China relation probably is the European. So European will not choose whether stand on the China side or U.S. side. And neither U.S. and China should ask the rest of the world to choose side. So we should prohibit the multilateral confrontations, manage the China and the U.S. confrontation just bilateral.
Are you living in the ideal world? What you're saying, right, mother-in-law theory, I'm not sure it's working.
Let's remember the history. Do not turn this bilateral confrontation to multilateral confrontation.
That is exactly the concern here. Well, you are reminding probably many in China not to forget the history. Whether the history is being remembered from the other end is a big question, Professor Yao. From the United States, for example, about this.
I'm more realistic than Jiandong, I think, in that case.
Okay, go ahead.
United States is still the dominating economy, dominating power in the world, right? China is an emerging power. China's economy is catching up with the United States. To answer your question, I think if the two largest economies can resolve some emerging issues, that's going to set up a good example for the rest of the world. And also, we have to realize, the production network now is around China and the United States, and also EU, but the dominant is just China. That's the world's factor, right? So if we just break up the U.S.-China relations, that means the whole production network, global-wise, just breaks up. So that's going to have huge ramifications for the whole world. So I believe to resolve bilateral issues first is the right approach. If you want to go to WTO, those multilateral organizations, it's really difficult to solve any problem, right?
What advice would you give every one of you as a well-known scholar about, the chaos, unpredictability, uncertainties both businesses and everyone else in the world are facing right now? Professor Lehman, you want to go first, briefly?
Sure. I think I should confess I am an optimist. Our two countries have benefited enormously from cooperation in the business sector, in the cultural sector, in the economic sector generally. And I think the leaders of both countries recognize that. I think what we need now is positive momentum. And I'm hopeful that this first stage will give us some positive momentum. Of course, the first stage is going to take care of the easy questions. I think it is important for the negotiators to have an approach to address the hardest questions, which are the questions about industrial policy, what are sometimes called the structural questions. Those are questions that are not just U.S.-China. There are also EU-China. There are also Japan-China, for the reasons that have been said before. And I think it's very important that we work on two fronts at the same time. First, we build positive momentum, but at the same time, we also start to find a way through, a way forward with respect to industrial policy.
All right. Professor Zhu, of course, the American perspective as what's considered as the most difficult and the most important may not be necessarily what China sees as the most difficult and the most important. What is your perspective about that?
Be practical. So the middle ground, which we call competitive coexistence, is reachable. So that's what my suggestions. There are a lot of agreements between U.S. and China. And there are some disagreements in U.S. and China. Keep the difference, but let's do what we agree.
Seeking the common ground.
Right.
Last but not least, Professor Yao.
United States probably needs to send China some signal of releasing some of the restrictions put on Chinese investment in the United States. China has opened up the market. China has begun to import a lot of U.S. products. But if the United States keep, say, entity list and also restriction on Chinese technology produced in U.S. like Huawei's laboratory in Silicon Valley, that's not going to increase our confidence.
Good gesture is very important for both sides at this moment particularly. Thank you so much for joining us, Xu Jiandong, Yao Yang, and Jeffrey Lehman. Really appreciate it. Thank you. And that is all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more, try to find us World Insight CGTN into your search engine, or check out our YouTube channel. You can also follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Sina Weibo. From me, Tian Wei, and everyone on the World Insight team, thanks for watching, and tune in again next time for more insights across China and around the world. Bye for now.